Right, thank you everybody and welcome. Today we want to focus on the question of why face is so valuable in human interactions. That is, today Michael, Sławek and I want to focus on which function face has for human and non-human primates. And so today, we'd like to start off with defining face and the subcomponents it has. Michael will then talk about face in interdisciplinary research and tell us about the aspects it shares with non-human primates. And finally, Sławek will discuss the how we can nationalize the concept of face, and will tell us about face as seed-based reputation. And first of all, I'd like to begin with defining the concept of face as we find it in pragmatics. And according to Goffman, face can be understood as the positive social value a person effectively claims for themselves by the line others assume they have taken during a particular contact. That is, in simple words, face is understood as being a dyadic concept. It's interpersonal, that is, it's on loan from society. And so face can be one of the ways in which we manage rapport or self and other. And in this strong interpersonal aspect, we can also say that face requires shared intentionality to function. And so in managing self and other, face can also be a tool for reputation management in cost-benefit analysis of politeness. And now face can be broken down into some lower level components that are closely related to, but also distinct from the concept of face. These concepts are, for instance, self-image or self-worth, interpersonal affect, identity, and also reputation. And I'm going to be talking about each of them in turn. I'd like to start with self-image and self-worth. And this seems to be distinct from, but also overlapping with face, in that speakers can modify their self-image to influence their face, for instance, by dressing up smartly for a conference talk. But the major distinction between the two is that the speaker can entertain a self-image quite separately from interaction with other speakers. But face, especially in the line of Goffman, can only be relevant within interactions, that is, when we are in dyadic relationships with others. This is harking back to what Goffman's idea about face being on loan from society is all about. Then we have interpersonal affect, and this is also very similar to face, but cannot be fully equated to it. And we can see this distinction very nicely if we use an example. So let's imagine we have a speaker, and the speaker has a malicious intent in uttering a critical comment in a conference Q&A. And our hero now has two options available to him or her. That is, the hero can now accept this face-threatening act and in turn lose face in this setting. Or alternatively, the hero can pretend that the speaker was actually aiming to express a supportive intent with this criticism. And so in our conference Q&A, the hero's face would then remain intact. They would not lose face, but the interpersonal relation between speaker and hero could then suffer. And now let's turn to identity. Identity and face are very closely related concepts. Some researchers, in essence, also equate these two. And what face shares with identity is that both entail that we have a positive social image about self or other, and that both can be intersubjectively constructed together with other interactants. Where they differ, though, and that's key here, is that face is bestowed upon the other post factum, that is, by others after an interaction. And so it's the line we assume others take. And identity, on the other hand, can also be bestowed upon the self by the self. That is, I can create my identity independent of another party. So identity might be a phenomenon that's even broader than the concept of face. And finally, I would like to briefly turn to reputation, which Sławek will be going into more detail on later. And reputation can essentially be seen as universal currency for human social interactions. And it's similar to face in that both signal what an individual, be it a human or possibly also a non-human one, is likely to do in a given situation. And so it is a valuable concept with pragmatics and also evolutionary studies. What we think where reputation might differ, though, can best be explained with the concept of what we call in German Fremdschämung. That is, imagine you're witnessing somebody make an embarrassing blunder, for instance. Imagine me if I were to burp during my conference presentation just now. And you as a listener would not lose face, your own face would not be at stake, but you are very likely to still feel embarrassed for me because as a social animal, you understand that your reputation, that my reputation has suffered in this case. And I would now like to hand over to Michael, who will be talking about face in interdisciplinary research.
Okay, so face is also relevant in other disciplines, including behavior, social psychology, primatology, comparative psychology. And I briefly want to focus on comparative psychology and things in comparative psychology that are related to face. And those are mostly related to the concept of reputation, which is related to the question how cooperation is maintained with a social group and is treated in the concept of the evolution of cooperation in social groups. Next slide. So reputation in the perspective of comparative psychology can be described as the knowledge of an individual's typical behavior in a situation based on their past behavior. And there's essentially three ways to gain that kind of knowledge, and that is direct experience with somebody else, observing somebody else's behavior towards somebody else, or in humans, gossip, so hearing about somebody else's behavior. Now, if we look at primates, and especially non-human primates, the question is, how are reputations formed? So is it based mainly on direct interactions or also on observation? In the literature, there have been a number of potential mechanisms that have been proposed to be involved in the formation of reputation. And these include, for example, social eavesdropping, image scoring, and social evaluation. A related question is not only how reputation formation works, so how do you basically assign a reputation to others, but also reputation management. So the question whether non-human primates actively try to manage their reputation. Next slide. And there have been some interesting experiments on reputation formation and reputation management. Regarding reputation formation, Zubial et al., for example, did a study where they showed chimpanzees to humans interacting, and one of them was generous and the other was selfish. So you see here somebody's like begging, and in one condition they had somebody giving the begging person something, and the other they would always refuse. And they found that the small number of chimpanzees in their study preferred generous to selfish individuals later when they kind of were given the chance to interact with these humans directly. Russell et al. Had a similar setup and also found that chimpanzees prefer nice, in this case, over nasty humans to interact with. However, in gorillas, bonobos, and orangutans, no such preference was found. Finally, Herman and colleagues had a similar setup where basically they had a nice person trying to give something to a participant, and the mean person would try to interrupt it. And you see that below. In a later stage, then both the mean and the nice person were interacting with the ape, and the ape and chimpanzees and orangutans preferred then interacting with the nice person they just witnessed the interaction history of, and not the mean person. Bonobos, however, did not show preference. What we can see from that is that indirect reputation judgment based on the observation of others is present at least to some degree in some of the other great apes. Next slide. Regarding reputation management, we have data that in 5-year-olds, we can see reputation management. So here you have you have a setup where children have to complete a puzzle, and you see there's a star in the middle. And in the stealing condition, to complete their puzzle, they needed to steal part of the stars from another child's kind of puzzle and the child wasn't in the room. In the helping condition, they had one additional star on their puzzle, and they could give it to the other child's puzzle, although the child was not in the room. Now, what they did was that in one condition, nobody was in the room, and in another condition, a peer was in the room. And children stole significantly less often from the other child's puzzle if somebody was in the room, and they also helped more often if a peer was in the room. Now, for chimpanzees, there was a similar concept, so they could either steal or help steal from a chimpanzee or help another chimpanzee, and for them it did not matter whether somebody was observing them or not. So in both conditions, they stole and helped significantly off the same amount, basically. However, chimpanzees help their friends more than neutral peers. And what we can get from that is that reputation management seems to be something that is not really present in non-human primates. And Sławek is next with his part of the presentation. He's going to share his screen for that. And this was one aspect of naturalizing face. Looking at primatology, and Sławek is going to present another aspect of how to naturalize face.
Okay, so let me take over. For that, I will try to share my screen, which I should be able to do.
Yes.
And hopefully, all right, perfect. Okay, good. So when it comes to the concept of face, it is a concept that comes from qualitative studies, but it is also interesting. It seems, as was mentioned, it seems as one that is potentially immensely useful for behavioral research and more quantitatively oriented research. But in order for it to be applicable to such ends, it would need to be made measurable and also kind of reduced to variables that are more standard in behavioral research. All right. So my starting point in this part of the presentation is linguistic politeness and the realization or the statement that in a lot of this kind of naturalistically oriented research, linguistic politeness is treated in quasi-economic terms, which is already quite promising. Virtual currency, coin of payment, surrogate good, and so on and so forth. It has some costs, and this is illustrated by examples that I'll just skip in the interest of time. But to sum this up, when you use linguistic politeness, there is an assumption that you are using this virtual currency, but not just linguistic politeness is transferred, but some other good or something else of value kind of also gets transferred together with that. So in a very simplistic model, this actual resource that gets transferred is face. And we can imagine, again, a simplistic model that when you use linguistic politeness, for example, you thank to somebody profusely for something, right? You use linguistic politeness, you lose a little bit of face and you transfer that quality to that person whom you thank, and their face gets increased, if we think about it as a numerical variable, by that amount, right? Which already is visible that it's a simplistic model, but bear with me. Okay, but face is also kind of something that is not a standard measure in behavioral studies. For it to be usable, we would need to kind of ground it in other variables that are recognized in behavioral research, and ideally in variables that are relevant to other primates, for example. Okay. Yes. So face would be just this middle level between linguistic politeness and variables that are most naturalistic, so to say, right? And we could say that face is equivalent to like general reputation, Or then we can say that face is equivalent to C-based reputation more specifically. Let's consider this distinction. This distinction into C-based and W-based reputation is from a recent study, and it's based on a very well-established distinction in social psychology by Fisk between competence and warmth, right? So we changed it a little bit into the vertical and horizontal component of reputation. So first, C-based is competence. It is related to hierarchy. It's related to the vertical dimension and its capacity to acquire resources and then hold on to resources once you have them. And then W-based reputation is for warmth, helpfulness, generosity, trustworthiness, and so on, right? So once again, competence, acquiring resources, warmth, sharing resources. Now, when it comes together, is that with those two components, you can model somebody else's kind of utility as a cooperative partner, right? So imagine that you need to select a cooperative partner. You want to build a house together or hunt a stag, right? You can choose me or Peter, right? And for example, you know that I'm very competent, right? So you will build a big house together with me. But if I'm not very warm, then I might not be willing to share this house with you, right? So your eventual gains will be zero, right? So your expected utility, and I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer, expected utility is like the product of the total gains from the cooperation, which depend on the competence of how competent the cooperators are, but also is the share that you get from that cooperation, which depends on the warmth of that cooperator, or perceived warmth. Well, maybe actual one. Yes. So this would be like the common denominator, right? Why is competence valuable and why is warmth valuable as parts of your image? Because judging by these variables, others may estimate your usability as your desirability, as a cooperative partner. Okay, so this is one account. So face would be reputation in general. So both competence and warmth. But if you inspect how face tends to be used in research, as well as some models of linguistic politeness, it might be that it corresponds more to C-based reputation. So it will not be entire reputation, it would be just this competence-related dimension that is more vertical, more hierarchical, related to power. And here are some examples from the literature that testify to this. And then I didn't really have that much time. I have about 1 minute. So let me just add that from previous research, it is confirmed that people usually tend to care more about their perceived competence than perceived warmth. So they value competence a little bit more, especially in individualistic societies. In collectivist societies, it's not that they value warmth more, but it's the difference is more. So here is one example. Another example is another quote from our recent paper that sums up some correspondences. That sums up some correspondences between face and competence-based reputation specifically. And I will probably need to hand over to Monika at this point for conclusions.
All right, Sławomir, would you just mind sharing the slides for this part?
Oh,
all right.
Yes. All right.
No worries, I'll do it.
All right.
All right. So as our conclusion, we would say that there are many components of face that, first of all, face is a concept in pragmatics and also in politeness that is a very valuable concept to explain how politeness and face work. And there are also many components of face, such as reputation or identity, and would like to explore these further and how they're connected in further research. There are also many components of face that seem to be shared with other highly social species, especially other primates, as Michael has shown today. But we think that the explicit management and the explicit negation of face seems to be uniquely expressed in human interaction, and especially so through the use of language. And so we would very much like to thank you and invite questions. You can also catch at least Michael and I later on the Gather Town. And so there are the references as well.
Yeah.